Mr. Speaker. I continue my remarks from Tuesday when we commenced discussion of this bill. On that day, I particularly focused on the issue of the powers which are sought as a result of this bill for the Chief Executive of the Office for Early Childhood Development, and indeed I'll therefore spend less time on that today. Today I will go through the bill briefly in terms of what it is created to do, and we'll come back to where the opposition is landing in terms of its support, most likely with a final position between the houses if it does not if we conclude our work in the House of Assembly today. Highlight again that we had expected originally, when the Minister for Education and I departed for World Skills, that this bill might have been likely for next week, and so therefore I had hoped to have that time during the school holidays to receive feedback from a range of early childhood education providers and other stakeholders. I'm not complaining about this. I understand that this is a function of the House, that bills can come on quicker than expected, but when we did depart, I believe that there were about 30 bills or thereabouts higher than this one in the order of precedence, and when we came back, we discovered that last sitting week the government had guillotined more bills last sitting week than all governments in the combined history of South Australia up until last sitting week had done. So therefore this was elevated somewhat in the precedence. Therefore we have not yet had feedback from many of those organisations yet. I've spoken to a couple. I anticipate hearing from a great many more in the next couple of weeks. But if the bill passes today, as it may well with the government's support, then we will have time nevertheless between the Houses and the Liberal Party. If we have any further amendments to make or opposition to offer, then that will be made clear in the Legislative Council. So, speech could begin here if those wishing to just have a quick summary of the opposition's position are following. The Gillard Royal Commission into Early Childhood Education recommended, amongst other things, that there be an Office for Early Childhood Development, established in legislation as a steward for South Australia's early childhood education sector. Noting that this sector comprises government and non-government institutions, with the non-government sector including community not-for-profit institutions, small businesses and massive national companies based either here in South Australia or indeed some interstate, Commissioner Gillard argued that the sector, which she and the government sometimes calls a system, perhaps aspirationally, is very difficult to coordinate, and so a system steward is required in order to achieve strategic targets for our state. So argues Commissioner Gillard. In particular, the Commissioner set an aspirational target for a reduction in the proportion of South Australian children who are developmentally vulnerable when starting school from the 23.8% currently, which is above the national average, down to 15%. This is the Early Childhood Development Census data. Comes out every 3 years or so. One of the office's functions in the legislation, described as the primary function, is to achieve this reduction. To that end, the bill creates certain powers for the office, particularly in relation to information gathering over both other government departments and also non-government providers. And given the other functions, such as, and I quote, to align supports and services with the needs of children, and, quote, to provide overall strategic direction in relation to government early childhood development services, end quote, it is set up to provide a level of central coordination for the sector based on government power and authority, potentially matched by increased government support for non-government providers, but we shall see. It should be noted, as I explained on Tuesday, this office already exists. It was established as a government department with its own CE, Kim Little, and departmental officers. Like most government departments, it was established under the powers of the Public Sector Act. Establishment under legislation of its own provides certain extra powers not available to other CEs. The Minister for Human Services does not have such power. The Minister for Transport's CE does not have such power. But the Minister for Education's CE in the Office for Early Childhood Development will have certain powers available to ombudsmen and other statutory officers in other departments. So those extra powers not available to other CEs, it also sets the functions of the office in legislation, complicating potentially the task for any future government to adapt any policy outcomes should that be desired. The matters which the government has provided and the opposition considers favourably include an agreed an agreed position between government and opposition, and I imagine some minor parties as well, that government can play an important role in improving early childhood development outcomes, including through support or coordination with non-government providers. The first 3 years of children's life, the first 1,000 days as often described, are a time of rapid development and potential vulnerability. Positive interventions to address vulnerabilities during this stage, whether through the early diagnosis and treatment of a challenging condition, or even just the social opportunities created by playgroups, for example, can improve a child's short and long-term prospects. Playgroups are an example that I'll probably come back to because we know the value of playgroups. Playgroups in South Australia have a long history of establishment, but they're established in a fairly ad hoc fashion. Some areas have a wealth of playgroups, some have few. Government preschools have a history of going back to the old kindergarten union days of providing playgroups where they can, but where they are full, they don't. And so consequently, playgroups were a pretty good example of the work that was done during the former government's early childhood plan, announced in our last budget before the change in government, having playgroups, SA, supported to better coordinate the establishment of new playgroups, potentially through some grants, was a key part of that plan. A higher so a higher proportion of South Australia's children are coming to school with some form of developmental vulnerability than the national average. One of the key measures in that $50 million package that I described, the early childhood budget package in the last year of the Marshall Liberal government, was the provision of $16 million a year, which was going to be it is an ongoing budget allocation. It's been continued by the new government for an increased scale and numbers of the free child development checks being made available for preschool-aged children. These checks were identified as a significant lever to improve outcomes for children and better prepare them for their learning at school, and that is now being rolled out. To put that into context, everybody in South Australia who has had a child in the last couple of decades would know all about the Blue Book. When the child is born, you have these development checks and you go through the system. What is less known, in fact, known as we did the research 3 years ago to less than half of parents, is that there are actually two other stages at which those development checks are offered as well. Because the problem is that I think it was the 18 months and 3 years, but less than half of South Australian parents were actually getting those checks done at those points. 25% for one of them and 33% for the other. And those checks enable early diagnosis of serious conditions. Those checks can also be a reference point where families can be pointed towards services, whether active services to potentially remediate a vulnerability, or passive services such as playgroups, which I described before, which in and of themselves can help reduce the risk of vulnerability. That $16 million a year was funded for two things. It was to add an additional 2 checks to the system, including a preschool aged check, and there was another one in one of those interim years, but also to massively expand the delivery of those checks so that it would, while potentially not being a universal check, because it is obviously a voluntary check, I think the research showed that we developed that it wasn't in the most part because parents were not wanting these checks. It was in the most part because they weren't aware of them, or potentially that they weren't convenient. And so the work was being done and continues to be done to roll that out more broadly, to find ways to make it more convenient and indeed to fund the delivery of that. Question would often come back when we announced this in 2021, well, is there funding adequate to the task of providing those interventions where needed? Ultimately, interventions where needed were often going to be universal service provisions anyway. Somebody has an entitlement to something that could be funded under Medicare or potentially through one of the disability programs, then that is a matter for those parts of government to fund. But while there is a challenge in workforce in some of those areas, it wasn't necessarily. Ultimately, there is a saving to government in the longer term too, because we know that early intervention, Mr Deputy Speaker, who's a former Minister for Disabilities, you know well that early intervention will often improve an individual's life outcomes, but in terms of the government service provision, the earlier you can provide a service, often that will lower the cost in the long term, because you'll have a reduced level of service required in many cases. So, putting aside for a moment the consideration of whether a government unit should be legislated, as this bill provides, the premise of a unit within government providing a certain level of policy leadership for the early childhood development education sector has some merit. One doesn't need the recommendations of a Royal Commission to identify that there are significant geographical childcare black spots within South Australia where it is difficult to find long daycare services. There are workforce shortages across the sector. There are infrastructure challenges. But given that the Department for Education is primarily responsible for the provision of early childhood services only within the public system, and certainly prior to the Marshall government's recent budget measures, there were few examples where the state government played a role in that sector beyond that of either service provider through the Department for Education, and mostly public preschools, but not entirely, and also as a regulator through the Education Standards Board. Non-government service providers, largely long daycare services, are mostly funded by Commonwealth subsidies and parental fees, with a modest state government subsidy paid to some centres with various historical arrangements of an ad hoc nature. It's been argued that any attempt to lift outcomes and reduce vulnerabilities for children across the state through the levers available to the early education and care providers is severely limited by the ad hoc nature of the sector, albeit the government is obviously now preparing fairly large financial engagement now. It's likely that many early childhood services will attract a certain level of extra funding as a result of the government's 3-year-old preschool program, given that to deliver on the model to which the government has committed, the Gillard model, a preschool type offering, or the preschool dose, to be available as part of their progressive universal service delivery model. It'll be required to be delivered at hundreds of non-government long daycare facilities. 70% of children captured under the government's model will not have access to preschools as 3-year-olds, but will receive their, and I use the word again, dose. It's an unusual word. Maybe it's the right word, but it's an unusual one. Their dose of preschool type offering in their childcare service. These non-government long daycare services will continue to be funded in their current manner, so there's no subsidy for children, 3-year-olds, to have free preschool, as I think many parents who voted for it were potentially expecting. They will have their parental fees, albeit with the Commonwealth rebates that are pretty generous, certainly by world standards for most parents. But there would be a level of state government funding required to support the requirement for there to be a teacher in the 3-year-old room, for it to be described as a preschool room. Further, in the briefing provided by the department, and I again, as I did on Tuesday, I reiterate my gratitude to CE Kim Little, Joanna Blake and Jamie Burt from the Department for Education, Amy Ralphs from the Minister's Office, thanks to Nick Kimberley from the Minister's Office for coordinating it at brief notice. The briefing I received, the department assured me that the government had undertaken a wide amount of targeted consultation and that a number of services had welcomed the bill. So that is my encapsulation of the arguments in favour of the bill, if you like. We have some areas of concern that give us pause before being able to offer our support for the bill. I indicated earlier that we will consider a matter further between the houses, particularly relying on the feedback that we expect to receive in the next couple of weeks from a range of those services. There are probably 2,000 stakeholder organisations in South Australia affected, largely long daycare services, preschools and out-of-school hours care services, but also some fairly significant umbrella group stakeholders as well in that. So, The first matter of concern that the government, I'm sure the Minister in his second reading response will have some comment, is the question, why legislate? The Public Sector Act provides all the powers needed to create a department. It has already done so in relation to this department. A department or a unit within a department. Other government departments do not have their own Acts of Parliament. Rather, Acts are committed to ministers. Those ministers are supported in the administration of those Acts by public servants operating in public service administrative units, such as departments, as per Section 24 and onwards in the Public Sector Act. Bodies established with their own legislation, i.e. a statutory authority, which this will sort of become, have unique reasons for operating under that framework. Some are bodies that have become part of government or were created by government to operate, or at least appear to operate, independently of the government. For example, universities, the art gallery, the various arts institutions largely operate under their own acts. I was reflecting that Greg Mackey, when he was giving testimony just this Monday in the SARC committee, the Statutory Authorities Review Committee of the Parliament, which is currently undertaking an investigation into the museum and the art gallery. He described a conversation he had with Don Dunstan about why South Australia has more separate Acts of Parliament for the arts organisations than any other state does. And I paraphrase Greg Mackey's paraphrasing of Don Dunstan. My recollection was that he said, basically, if they're legislated, then they're very hard to change or get rid of. And that was the purpose for which a lot of those Acts of Parliament were created. And as the Shadow Minister for Arts, I'm certainly happy to see that. But of course, those arts organisations largely organise their affairs separately from the government of the day, depending on government funding from the government of the day, but ultimately it's a matter for them to organise their priorities without necessarily having to have recourse to the government of the day, unless they want to explore some opportunity for major restructure such as the museum's just done, and ultimately we come back to this bill though. It's worth reflecting, and the Minister may have advice in his second reading response, on whether, as an established department through legislation, the operations of the Department for Early Childhood Development, the Office for Early Childhood Development, will be subject to the strictures of the Legislative Council's Statutory Authorities Review Committee. I look forward to hearing that advice. Some bodies established under their own legislation are legislated because government wishes them to act in a corporatised manner, for example, TAFE SA or SA Water. Some are bodies with oversight or advocacy roles that require a level of independence from government in order to conduct their functions. We're talking about the Guardian for Children and Young People, the Children's Commissioners, for example. Some are units of governments that require special powers specifically set out in legislation in order to do their work, for example, the Ombudsman or the ICAC. The reason for legislating in this case, over and above the fact that it was a recommendation of the Gillard Royal Commission, appears to be the desire to create information gathering powers for the CE and the Office. And I talked about them to an extent on Tuesday, and I'll come back to them. The other feature of legislated units of government, common to all, and this sort of goes to what Don Dunstan was talking about, is that the functions, purposes and duties of statutory authorities are much harder for a new or a future government to amend than those of a regular department or an attached office. So a body created by the Premier under the Public Sector Act or the Administrative Arrangements Act potentially can be edited or abolished by a new Premier. However, an Act of Parliament is required to amend the duties of an office created by an Act of Parliament. Couple of examples. The Department for State Development under the Wetherill government became the Department for Innovation and Skills, with a number of its other functions separated into separate departments under the Marshall government. Stephen Marshall had a strong view that one CE should be responsible for one department and reporting to one minister wherever possible, with clear lines of authority, not to create silos but to create clarity. And indeed, the Department for industry and skills, as it was, became innovation and skills, and under the new government became, I think, innovation, industry and science under the Deputy Premier, and is now the Department for State Development again, with other departments folded back into it. So departments can be created or abolished or amended by a Premier to serve the state as efficiently according to the government's priorities of the day. That is not capable of being the case with a department established under an Act of Parliament. Establishing, as it does, as a result of the functions of this bill, the legislative responsibility for the government to deliver three-year-old preschool, I note the fact that the government will, of course, not be delivering on that promise because they don't have the workforce, and they've set out a new delayed timeline of 2032. However, the good news is for the Minister and for the government, they can be comforted by the fact that there are no enforcement provisions in this bill if they don't deliver on its requirement. We'll talk about the functions briefly. The Clause 6 of the bill sets out the functions for this office, and given that as a department, if it was established as this one has been already under the Public Sector Act, the Premier of the day can set out his priorities or her priorities for any department. This Parliament, this House, is seeking to instead take that role and set out the priorities for this department. They do so through the functions set out in Clause 6. They are in the bill, but I propose to read them so that members are clear in what is being established. The primary function of the office is to act as steward of the state's early childhood development system, and in particular to reduce the proportion of children in the state who are developmentally vulnerable when starting school. The office also has the following additional functions. To facilitate, commission and support research relating to early childhood development. B, to support and facilitate the development of systems, policies and processes for the secure sharing of data across the early childhood development system. C, to support the universal reach of child health and development checks. D, to promote a vision of place-based, responsive and connected service delivery, building early childhood education and care as the backbone of a universal early childhood development system. E, to promote universal access to 3- and 4-year-old preschool, developing and implementing funding models and connecting preschool providers to the broader early childhood development system. F, to develop, implement and fund fit-for-purpose infrastructure and targeted programs and services, including commissioning integrated service hubs to support the early childhood development of children at increased risk of developmental vulnerability. G, to align supports and services with the needs of children by partnering with families, state authorities, non-government organisations and local and Commonwealth governments. H, to provide the overall strategic direction in relation to government early childhood development services. I, to commission or recommission government services as required. J, to promote the recognition of the cultural and linguistic diversity of children accessing services within the early childhood development system. K, to promote the participation of children with disability in the early childhood development system. L, to promote the participation of children in care, children who are in contact with the child protection system and children who are receiving child and family support services in the early childhood development system. M, to undertake strategic workforce planning to support early childhood reforms and service provision. And N, any other functions conferred on the office by or under this or any other act or by the Minister. It's a fairly long list, sir. I note that the South Australian Museum has its own Act of Parliament. In that Act, there is a requirement for the museum to, I think, facilitate or conduct research, scientific research. It's been a moment in the last few months where that has become incredibly problematic for the state government because the board of the South Australian Museum, led by the former chair Kim Cheetah, decided that that wasn't going to be what the museum was going to do anymore and sought to remove the 27 scientific research positions that had been undertaking that function under the Museum Act. Now, the Act was written in such a way that arguably they were not breaching the law in doing so, but they certainly breached the spirit of that Act, and it created enormous problems for the government. The government has now put in $4 million over 2 years to sort of push that problem past the election potentially, but unless further funding is provided or unless the government wants to amend the legislation, then they are going to have to address their failure to meet that function, which is in the Act for that statutory authority. The Premier announced last Thursday that there would be consideration and working with the universities to how that function might be fulfilled. But they don't have an answer for that yet, sir. Now, that's a long list of priorities the government has. Many of them are consistent with government policy, the 3-year-old preschool, for example, being legislated in this way. Some of them are in relation to operational matters. I highlight an example. The bill proposes to commission integrated service hubs. Now, that's not something that alarms me in any way. I think that sounds great. That's what we currently think is the appropriate way to go about bringing services together. But what happens, sir, if through a result of federal-state relations changing or offering new service models or new research, offering a different way forward, requires an Act of Parliament to change that from being something this office is legislated to deliver. It's not potentially a reason to oppose the bill in itself. It's certainly a matter for consideration, and certainly a matter for the government to consider as it seeks to legislate officers of the public service rather than allowing the Premier to use his powers under the Public Sector Act, as has been traditionally the norm. Anyway, those are the functions, and when people are debating the merits of whether or not there should be early childhood education services provided by such an office, I just want to be very clear. That's not what this bill does. That work is already done. This office already exists. This bill just establishes whether the functions are going to be there in perpetuity or requiring an Act of Parliament change, and or whether or not the extra powers can be created. So I'll finish with talking about the extra powers. Section 10 of the Act sets out the powers for the Chief Executive to require information of another government department. In doing so, to be clear, the Chief Executive can ask another state authority to prepare and provide a report in relation to any matters specified in the notice, so long as those matters are obviously relevant to the functions of the Act. That's 10.1. And the response, if the other state authority refuses or fails to comply with this request for information, the Chief Executive can report the refusal and failure to the Minister and to the Minister responsible for that other state authority. The Chief Executive includes the details of that failure, and then the Minister may, by notice in writing, exempt a state authority from the operation of this section. Not sure which Minister. At any rate, we will see what happens there. Ultimately, there is, I assume the Minister for Education is the arbitrator. So if the Chief Executive of the Department for Early Childhood, the Office for Early Childhood Development, seeks information from the Minister for Human Services Department, and the Minister for Human Services Department says, this is a burden, we don't think it's important, we're not going to do it, then the Chief Executive of the Early Childhood Development Office tells the Minister of Human Services, the Minister for Education, and the Minister for Education has to tell the Minister for Human Services to get her people to provide the information. As best I can tell it, and if there's a disagreement, I'm not sure what happens after that. At any rate, Clause 11 is potentially the more interesting one. I'm sure you guys can work that out. Clause 11 is... I think that may be a potential solution. Anyway, I apologise for having my own side conversation with the Minister for Human Services there. Clause 11 is the one on which I have potential concerns. Clause 11 sets out that the Chief Executive can require a specified entity, which can basically be anyone who's relevant to the early childhood services sector, anyone who's relevant to the functions of this Act, and seek information. And that information could be on really any matter that can be related to the functions of the Act. The entity must provide that information within the period specified by the Chief Executive. That's quite significant power. and we're reliant on the Chief Executive to use it in a reasonable way, because an entity who refuses or fails to comply with such a notice is guilty of a new offence with a $5,000 penalty. And that, again, if the state authority refuses or fails to comply with the notice, the Chief Executive may report the refusal or failure to the Minister, and indeed there is that offence provision of $5,000. The Minister may, by notice in writing, exempt an entity from the operation of this section. So the Minister for Education, again, is then in a position to alleviate that $5,000 fine. I imagine that this power would likely not be abused. I would certainly hope so. This is already a fairly regulated area. And there are certain information provisions that have to be provided to government in return for government funding. I'm unclear as to why these new provisions are so necessary. This stick is so required to get this information, especially if it is largely going to be in relation to providing funding to services, long daycare services, for example, if it's related to the 3-year-old preschool program. There is a financial transaction there that can require certain information to be provided. What would really concern me is if a family daycarer operating as a sole trader in effect, or a small business, a small mum and dad operation in a childcare centre, or indeed some other organisation associated with the early childhood sector, somebody running a playgroup, for example, had this notice provided to them by the Chief Executive seeking information which was useful to the department but not necessary for the people of South Australia to be accumulated by government necessarily, that person's got a $5,000 fine hanging over their head. And that's something on which we are seeking feedback more broadly from the sector to ensure that there is not fear of compliance burden. I'm not outright stating that this is going to be a problem. I'm seeking to have more feedback from the sector to see if they think it's going to be a problem. Indeed, also in relation to the sharing of information between entities at Clause 12, there's some fairly significant information sharing powers there, and they, I'm assured, are welcomed by many in the sector and the institutions that are identified as being captured by them, and I'm reassured by the Office for Early Childhood Development that that's the case, and I certainly hope that is, but we are going to the trouble of just checking. Because there are $10,000 penalties there for misuse. Now, I suspect that the information being sought to be shared there, a $10,000 penalty is probably appropriate. We don't want this information to be misused. I imagine that part is going to be less controversial. So, with all of that, I recognise that a number of the things this bill is seeking to do a number of the things that this bill talks about are welcome developments. A number of them were started under the former government. A number of the programs referred to were started under the former government, and I'm pleased to see them continuing. The new government has added to that list of programs, particularly through the measures set out in the Gillard Royal Commission, and indeed a number of those pieces of work are progressing with or without this legislation. This legislation sets some of those things in stone, and it provides opportunities for the government to have new powers. We're giving serious consideration to those, and we'll confirm that position between the houses.